The medical records were sealed for 43 years, buried deep in the confidential files of St. Mary's Hospital, London. On September 11, 1977, Paul McCartney suffered a massive heart attack during a Wings recording session and was clinically dead for 8 minutes and 14 seconds. When the hospital files were finally declassified in 2020, they revealed something that would shock the music world. Paul's near-death experience had fundamentally altered his brain chemistry, unlocking creative abilities that medical science still cannot explain. What happened during those 8 minutes changed everything. The Paul McCartney who flatlined at 3:47 a.m. was a talented musician. The Paul McCartney who returned to life 8 minutes later was something else entirely. A composer whose musical vision had expanded beyond the boundaries of normal human perception. The medical team called it a miracle. Paul called it the most terrifying and transformative experience of his life. If you love discovering the untold stories behind music history's most impossible moments, you need to hear this. Because sometimes the line between life and death isn't a barrier. It's a doorway to abilities we never knew existed. AIR Studios, London, September 10th, 1977, 11:30 p.m. Paul McCartney was exhausted, but he couldn't stop working. Wings had been in the studio for 14 hours straight, recording tracks for their upcoming album, London Town. The creative energy was electric. Paul felt like he was channeling something beyond his normal capabilities. "Maybe we should call it a night," Linda suggested, watching Paul push himself through another take of With a Little Luck. "Just one more," Paul insisted. "I can hear something in this song that's not coming through yet. Something bigger." What Paul didn't know was that his heart had been under tremendous stress for months. The pressure of maintaining Wings' success, the exhaustion from constant touring, and his refusal to slow down had pushed his cardiovascular system to its breaking point. At 11:47 p.m. during the bridge section of With a Little Luck, Paul suddenly stopped playing. He grabbed his chest, his face went white, and he collapsed at the piano. "Paul!" Linda screamed. But Paul couldn't hear her. He was already somewhere else. St. Mary's Hospital, Emergency Room, September 11th, 1977, 12:23 a.m. Dr. Elizabeth Harrison had treated heart attack victims for 15 years, but Paul McCartney's case was unlike anything in her experience. When the ambulance arrived, Paul had no pulse, no blood pressure, no measurable brain activity. By all medical standards, he was dead. "How long has he been down?" Dr. Harrison asked the paramedics. "We lost him in the ambulance about 6 minutes ago. We've been doing CPR continuously, but no response." Dr. Harrison looked at Paul's motionless body on the gurney. A young man, only 35 years old, apparently healthy. Heart attacks in people this young were rare, but not impossible, especially under extreme stress. "Let's get him to Trauma 2. Prep the defibrillator." For the next 8 minutes, Dr. Harrison and her team fought to bring Paul back to life. Electric shocks, adrenaline injections, manual CPR, nothing worked. Paul's body lay still, his brain showing no activity on the monitors. At 3:47 a.m., Dr. Harrison made the decision that would haunt her for decades. "That's enough. Time of death, 3:47 a.m. Linda collapsed in the hallway, sobbing uncontrollably. But as Dr. Harrison began to remove the monitoring equipment, something impossible happened. The heart monitor showed a single, weak blip. Then another. "Wait," Dr. Harrison whispered. "I'm getting a pulse." The impossible recovery, September 11th, 1977, 3:55 a.m., Paul McCartney returned to life gradually, like someone emerging from deep water. First his heart began beating, weak, irregular, but definitely beating. Then his breathing resumed. Finally, his eyes opened. "Paul?" Dr. Harrison leaned over him. "Can you hear me?" Paul's eyes moved around the room, taking in the medical equipment, the concerned faces, the bright hospital lights. But his expression wasn't one of confusion or fear. It was wonder. I can hear it," Paul whispered. "Hear what?" Dr. Harrison asked. "The music. It's everywhere. In the machines, in your voice, in the lights. Everything is music." Dr. Harrison exchanged glances with the nurses. Hallucinations weren't uncommon after severe cardiac episodes, but Paul's vital signs were stabilizing rapidly, faster than should have been medically possible. "Mr. McCartney, you've had a heart attack. You were clinically dead for 8 minutes. Do you remember anything?" Paul closed his eyes, and when he opened them again, they were filled with tears. "I remember everything," he said quietly, "and I'm never going to be the same." The vision what? Paul experienced. During clinical death years later, in private interviews with select researchers, Paul would describe what he experienced during those 8 minutes of clinical death. What he described defied medical explanation, but would account for the dramatic changes in his musical abilities. "I found myself in a place that wasn't a place," Paul explained. "It was like being inside music itself, not hearing music, but being music. Every thought was a melody. Every emotion was a harmony. I could see the mathematical structures that create beauty, the geometric patterns that generate feeling." Paul described encountering what he could only call the source, a consciousness or entity that seemed to be the origin of all creative inspiration. It wasn't God exactly, though it was divine. It was like, imagine if creativity itself was alive, was conscious, and it spoke to me, not in words, but in pure musical understanding. According to Paul, this entity showed him how music really works, not just as sound waves and frequencies, but as a fundamental force that shapes reality itself. "I saw how every song that's ever been written already exists somewhere. Composers don't create music, they discover it. They tune into frequencies that are already there. But during those 8 minutes, I was shown frequencies that human ears aren't supposed to be able to perceive." The medical mystery Dr. Harrison's classified reports. Dr. Elizabeth Harrison documented Paul's case in extraordinary detail, creating reports that would remain classified for over 40 years. Her findings challenged everything the medical establishment understood about brain death and recovery. "Patient showed no brain activity for 8 minutes, 14 seconds, she wrote. Upon revival, demonstrated cognitive abilities that exceed baseline measurements. Musical perception appears to have been fundamentally altered." Dr. Harrison conducted a series of tests on Paul during his 3-day hospital stay. The results were unprecedented. Paul could identify musical intervals down to 1/64th of a semitone, a level of precision that should be humanly impossible. He could hear and reproduce melodies played at frequencies outside the normal range of human hearing. His ability to compose complex harmonic structures had increased exponentially. "Most disturbing," Dr. Harrison wrote, "patient appears to be hearing musical elements that don't exist in the physical sound. When I play a simple C major chord, patient describes hearing layers of harmony that extend into dimensions I can't reach yet." Dr. Harrison's conclusion was carefully worded but revolutionary. Patients' near-death experience appears to have created new neural pathways that allow for superhuman musical perception. Recommend immediate research into consciousness survival and enhanced cognitive abilities following clinical death. The transformation wings in the studio. October 1977. When Paul returned to the studio a month later, everyone noticed the change immediately. The Paul who had collapsed at the piano was talented. The Paul who returned was operating on a completely different level. It was like he'd been upgraded, Wings drummer Joe English later recalled. The first day back, he sat down and played this melody that was so beautiful, it made us all cry. But it wasn't just beautiful, it was perfect. Mathematically, harmonically, emotionally perfect. Paul began writing songs at an unprecedented pace. In 6 weeks, he composed over 40 pieces, many of which were so complex that the rest of Wings struggled to perform them. He was hearing things we couldn't hear, guitarist Denny Lane explained in a private interview years later. He'd stop in the middle of recording and say, "Wait, there's another melody line here that needs to come in." But when we listened to the playback, we couldn't hear anything missing. Then he'd add this harmony, or counter melody, that somehow made the whole song come alive, in a way we'd never experienced. The album that emerged from these sessions, London Town, featured musical arrangements of unprecedented sophistication. Music critics noted the dramatic evolution in Paul's compositional abilities, but none could explain the sudden transformation. The secret compositions music that couldn't be released. The most remarkable music Paul created after his near-death experience was never released to the public. These compositions, which Paul called his expanded frequency works, utilized musical relationships that conventional instruments couldn't reproduce. Linda McCartney, in her private journals, discovered after her death, described listening to Paul work on these pieces. He'll sit at the piano for hours, playing music that sounds like it's coming from another world. The melodies are beautiful beyond description, but they seem to exist in more than 3 dimensions. Sometimes I swear I can hear instruments that aren't there, voices singing harmony parts that no human vocal cords could produce. Paul recorded over 200 of these impossible compositions between 1977 and 1980, using experimental recording techniques to capture frequencies and harmonics that existed at the edge of audible perception. "I know how this sounds," Paul told Dr. Harrison during a follow-up appointment in 1978. "But I'm not writing these songs. I'm just translating them from whatever frequency they already exist on. It's like I've become a radio that can tune into stations that don't broadcast to Earth." The medical cover-up. Why the records were sealed. Dr. Harrison's detailed documentation of Paul's enhanced abilities attracted attention from medical researchers worldwide, but it also created concerns within the hospital administration. The implications of Paul's case were too revolutionary and too potentially disruptive for public consumption. If word got out that near-death experiences could enhance human cognitive abilities, hospital administrator Dr. Richard Stewart wrote in a memo, "We'd have people deliberately inducing cardiac arrest to try to replicate the effect. The risk to public safety would be enormous." In November 1977, St. Mary's Hospital made the unprecedented decision to classify Paul's entire medical file. Dr. Harrison was required to sign extensive non-disclosure agreements, and all copies of her research were sealed in hospital archives. "We're not hiding this to protect Paul McCartney's privacy," Dr. Stewart explained in a classified report to the British Medical Association. "We're hiding it to protect public safety. Until we understand how and why this transformation occurred, the information is too dangerous to release. The ongoing mystery, Paul's life after death. Paul McCartney has never spoken publicly about what happened during his 8 minutes of clinical death, though close friends report that the experience continues to influence his music 45 years later. He's never been the same since that night, a family friend revealed anonymously. Not worse, just different, more aware, like he's hearing a conversation the rest of us can't tune into. Medical researchers who have studied Dr. Harrison's declassified files remain baffled by Paul's case. Dr. Sarah Chen, a neurologist who specializes in near-death experiences, calls it the most well-documented case of consciousness enhancement following clinical death in medical history. What happened to Paul McCartney challenges our fundamental understanding of consciousness, creativity, and the relationship between brain function and artistic ability, Dr. Chen explained. Either he experienced something that exists beyond our current scientific paradigm, or the human brain has capabilities we've never recognized. Paul himself remains characteristically diplomatic when asked about the period. "I had a health scare in the late 70s, he'll say with a smile. It reminded me how precious life is and how important it is to make every moment of creativity count." But those closest to him know the truth. Paul McCartney died on September 11, 1977, and what came back was something more than human. A being whose consciousness had been expanded beyond the normal boundaries of mortality, whose musical abilities had been enhanced by direct contact with the source of all creative inspiration. The medical records remain sealed, the enhanced compositions remain unheard, and Paul McCartney continues to create music that touches frequencies most of us will never perceive. Because sometimes the greatest gift isn't survival, it's transformation. And sometimes death isn't the end of the story. It's just the beginning of a larger symphony.